Finish your lunch. We're a few minutes early, but we have a lot of raffle books to give away. So if you don't mind, we're going to start just a few minutes early. You can continue chatting, but listen for your name. All right. We have Why is Math So Hard for Some Children by Dan Birch.
So we are thrilled, and momentarily we're going to be giving the Hollis Scarborough Award to Hollis. But first, we wanted to share something with you, and this will be over on this side. But about 2 years ago, Hollis Scarborough, Dr. Hollis Scarborough, who's the creator and the author of The Reading Rope, donated or gave to us the original Reading Rope and how it progressed. And when I say we are beyond honored, I can't say that enough. What Hollis has done was we took her theoretical framework with that Reading Rope and we built the AIM integrated literacy model. So I want you all to see Hollis has autographed it, and we are going to be framing it and keeping it in the halls of AIM to highlight her work. It's our Smithsonian artifact that will never leave our walls. So we wanted you to see that. And now we're going to introduce to you.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ken Pugh. Ken is one of those researchers who is very, very committed to making sure that the research in his lab and the labs of other researchers is translated into our classrooms. And we can't say enough about Ken's commitment to that. AIM is very, very honored to be part of Haskins Global Language and Literacy Innovation Hub. This has just opened our eyes to a whole new world of how to look at data with children, how to look at different aspects of this information. And through the work of Ken Pugh and Nicole Landy and others at Haskins, we actually have our very own EEG lab here at AIM, where all of the things you heard Guinevere talk about and Doug and Lynn Fuchs talk about, we get to see it with our children. And more importantly, the children get to see their brains working, and we get to provide that here. So it's an amazing activity, an amazing research study we're doing, and so Ken, we extend appreciation to you for that. So without further ado, Dr. Ken Pugh.
Am I on now? I think so. You can hear me in the back? So, I've spoken here many times, but never with such an opportunity to get emotional and to recognize a dear friend. I'm usually here talking about our latest work and you know, what we're after. I do want to begin by really thanking Nancy and Pat and the AIM community for welcoming us to do this amazing initiative with them, to be able to bring the research lab into the school to work together in a way where we're learning from each other very directly. What are the programs, what's working, how are kids responding, and then we can marry the research tools into the real world, if you will, of classroom treatment. And it's a very exciting prospect, one we talked about years ago where we said, wouldn't it be nice if we could really bring the research into the school? And it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And for those of you from AIM, we're really thrilled. My gang up in New Haven, Yale and Haskins, are thrilled every time they come down because they love seeing the students and working with the staff, and it's been great fun. So I'm really honored. I didn't want to forget that at the end once I start talking about my dear friend here. I also want to thank Nancy Hennessy, who has been a guiding force for me in connecting to the classroom for a very long time. And Nancy, it's always great to see you here. So now I do my duties today, as I'm the guy who gives this thing. It's a special treat for me to give this award to an amazing basic and applied scientist, Hollis Scarborough, at a place that values the link between research and practice. Hollis is a great figure in the world, and not because of this incredibly clever reading rope, which I admit is the coolest thing since sliced bread. And we all use it. I go all over the world. One thing I can expect to see, whether it's in Lima, Peru, or Monterrey, Mexico, or recently in Visakhapatnam, India, somebody talking about reading will have the reading rope, and that's amazing. But it doesn't give you any sense of who she is and where that rope came from. It wasn't just other people's work and a very clever way to bind it together. I'm sorry, it's supposed to be funny. But it's actually her work. Many of the strands on that rope go to Hollis's work. She began as a basic, what we call word nerd, which means the kind of cognitive scientist who tries to understand what goes on in the first couple hundred milliseconds from when the light hits your eye to when you know that's cat. And that work that Hollis did over the years, early on with her husband, Don Scarborough, and later on at Haskins Laboratories and at other places, was seminal in laying out how skilled reading occurs. We want all kids to reach a point of becoming fluent and automatic, but we need to know what that is made of. And as you know, it's made of parts, component processing. And Hollis's work in that area was extremely important. But Hollis also recognized that reading doesn't occur in a bottom-up vacuum. And so she began to consider very early on, what is it in early preschool life that makes kids either find this component processing and getting from I to meaning fast easy or hard? And her amazing work over the years on early predictors, the sort of one set of strands in the rope, is textbook in our field, is recognized as of the highest quality. Not limited just to phonologic awareness and other factors, but she was also early on thinking about things like late talking and how late talking would produce a risk for reading disability. We followed her work and did some brain imaging in 2000s that really came from her ideas because we've worked together at Haskins for a very long time. So Hollis was always one to say, let's think back as far into that rope or its origins as we can. Hollis also does amazing work that many of you probably don't know over the years in how the linguistic context that children live in, the dialect they speak, will influence the way they learn to read and whether it's hard or easy. And again, her studies and the impact of, on literacy of speaking African American vernacular was and continues to be of the highest quality and relevant to a model of how kids learn to read. Hollis also somewhere, I forget when, early 2000s, Hollis took a lead in a project at Haskins with the Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is part of Johns Hopkins University, one of the original MRDD centers, the Kennedy Krieger, to really begin to take the cognitive science that we know and do, and the neuroimaging, and try to apply it in the context of treatment studies. Guinevere was talking beautifully today about the promise of treatment studies and the limitations of those. And Hollis, again, had her stamp on looking at how different kinds of treatments are differentially affected in adolescence. And so these are just things, and I thought to mention them when I was thinking about this talk, because you know of her as a great supporter of research, of practice, and you know, a researcher, and of course the reading rope. But all of these areas are characterized by Hollis by something that I value most, and that is incredible integrity and tremendous rigor in her research. At a personal level, she is kind of a hero to me when I was, and you just now don't look at me and start making faces, but when I was a kid at Haskins, and now I'm not, we were kids together. Hollis was the kind of person you would go to, a little bit like Al Liberman was, where you knew you would get an argument and she would straighten you out. And Haskins is a place where we all work together from different fields, and we all kind of try to push each other in new directions. Hollis was always a person who would do things, for example, one I've always loved, Hollis would bring in these little refrigerator magnet-y things, like with quotes on them. And the quotes are always made to both annoy you and spur you on to better research. Kind of like, Ken, if you read this, you'll probably write better papers in the future. And so this is Hollis as a friend and a colleague. She is somebody who takes no prisoners. And I put it this way. Her colleagues know they'll get a dressing down if they get lazy in the way they're thinking. Not in the amount of papers they publish. We all publish. But in their thinking. She, above all else, and I don't want to go on too much longer, but above all else, Hollis is an old-fashioned, this is true, I'm sorry, an old-fashioned truth lover. She hates BS, whether it comes from people she works with or people she's never met. And she loves the process of uncovering truth and knowledge. And there are a few people we knew in our careers who had that quality. And for me, it was always Hollis that had that quality. And finally, she has been a great role model for many young researchers in the field and continues to be. She conveys all of these things that have made her own research remarkable and broad. As you know, as I'm saying, each of these areas, that could be a career for a lot of people. And Hollis has really touched on all of them with great methodological insight, creativity, and old-fashioned experimental designer, which is an important skill to have in our field. And so these are some of the things that I wanted to say about Hollis and how the IGNITE program, our collaboration, which brings research and practice together, very much reflect Hollis bringing us together. And finally, what I have here is I've got, you have to have this, I've got quotes. Sorry, so before I give the award, I got quotes from people in the field. The first, Don Shankweiler. For those of you who study reading, Don is a great seminal figure. Liberman, Shankweiler, and Shankweiler discovered phonologic awareness. Don is about 90-ish, still comes to the lab, loves Hollis. Ken. Hollis was never content to follow in anybody else's footsteps, ever. So in an era when the discussion of children's reading difficulties was dominated by their phonologic problems, as it should be, Hollis was nonetheless asking questions about the full developmental course of other language abilities and discovering that, for example, at certain ages, these can be diagnostic. One example of this research, he says, this is yet one example of Hollis's research that opened new vistas for the field. So from our elder to Hollis. Don Compton, the director of the Florida Center for Reading Research. Hollis is very giving to many junior scientists like myself. Don, you're actually not junior anymore, but I don't want to say anything. And she cares greatly about the future generation of reading researchers. Her mentoring and her support have helped many of us develop over time to the types of scholars who we hope she will be proud of. Her work on early identification of children at risk for developing RD was very important in my own work, his own work, on universal screening in children first grade with RTI framework. That could not have been done without Hollis's support. And lastly, and this is a special one, I think, Lori Cutting, yes, of course. So Lori Cutting, our dear friend and a friend of AIM and at Vanderbilt, who worked very closely with Hollis for a long time. When I think of Hollis, aside from being a world-class scientist of the highest caliber, the first word that comes to mind is elegant, which reflects her detailed approach, which is beautifully simplistic, yet totally complex upon deeper introspection. She has the most astounding way of pushing science by convening information in this manner. In short, she is one of a kind, and in addition, a wonderful friend, mentor, and colleague to all of us. With Lori's parting words, I want to invite Hollis Scarborough up for her award. Hollis. They have to take our picture with the...
It's not filled with champagne.
Yeah.
I just saw this. I don't know if... Is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I just saw this for the first time. I don't know if the rest of you were able to. It has the rope on it, etched on it. It is awesome. I'm going to leave it here for a while so you can see it. Thank you, Ken. That was a once-in-a-lifetime event.
And shorter than usual, you have to admit.
Yeah, I'm going to be able to get through. When you hear what I have to say, you'll be amazed at how much overlap there's going to be with what Ken said, and pictures of a lot of the people that he mentioned. This is my hanger. So this is an entirely thank you talk to everybody that made it possible to get that beautiful thing. And because the people at AIM love the rope so much, I decided to frame it around the rope, and it's a history of thinking as well as a history of the rope. And I like the title I came up with, A Case History of a Twisty Metaphor, because that is what it is, and the subject, of course, is the rope. Which one am I hitting? Yes. I'm sure there's someone who has not seen the rope before, contrary to what you've been hearing, so I'm going to very quickly go through what it is. It is a drawing of a rope being constructed from left to right over time, well labeled, and it represents all, as the title says, the many strands that are woven into skilled reading. And skilled reading is the end product, the tightly woven strong rope. And there are two bundles of strands that interact with each other over time. So the language comprehension strands, I limited it to 5, and I think they stood up well over time. The sentence, learning to spell correctly can be a life or death matter at Hogwarts, will be incomprehensible or wrongly comprehended if you do not have the background knowledge about what Hogwarts is and what learning to spell accurately means at Hogwarts. Eschewing the Vulgate can obfuscate the lucidity of your rhetoric, will be incomprehensible, obviously, if you don't know vocabulary. This is from Groucho Marx. Time flies like an arrow, but fruit flies like a banana. You will not appreciate that without an appreciation of the structural difference between those two otherwise similar, superficially similar sentences. Everybody had to learn this in English. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And when you learned it, your teacher made you think and reason about why taking one road versus the other would make all the difference and stuff. So you do have to think, and we're going to just use the blanket term verbal reasoning for that. And finally, literacy and print knowledge can mean 1,000 things, but for illustration, I decided to do something I discovered recently, is a perfectly matched pair of sentences, both ending in a period, that can mean opposite things if you punctuate them differently. So I'll read them. A woman without her man is nothing, or a woman without her man is nothing. There's a distinct gender gap in which one is preferred. And as Ken said, I'm a collector of quotes, and I thought that the other word nerds in the audience might like that quote from Auden, that insanity is perhaps an absence of punctuation for people like me. I love these, and I'm sure all the classroom teachers remember them, may not love them as much as I do, but you can learn so much about a child's progress on the other strands, the decoding and phonological awareness and word recognition strands, by looking at their little snippets of production instead of reading. So, can you root around and find a pink metal glasses case in my purse? I'm having trouble reading this. Thank you. No pictures with the glasses. Oh, that's better. So I'll read it for those of you who are not familiar with second grade spelling. My mom gave me a tablet. I think it is special because it makes me feel happy, because she gave it to me, and it is really pretty, and it cost a lot of money. They care about me, and I care about them. So let's just look at that circled word UV. The fact that she's spelling the oral word of as UV tells us she's got the alphabetic principle. She can obviously encode and decode, consonant, vowel, and that tells us, in retrospect, she must understand phonological awareness, which is that oral words are made up of smaller bits, okay, in order to do that. Where she And many teachers might call that an error, but it's not an error. It's a nice little diagnostic, because I think we all know that if she encountered OF in a text, she would read it correctly as of. It's only when she's producing it that she's going to go back to her phonological knowledge. So she has a lot of work to do on the production side in writing, but in reading she's doing really well for her age. Okay, I'm a developmental psychologist. That's the one thing Ken forgot to say. And everything I do has a developmental component. Things are always changing in time, and that's, why I get impatient with people who only look at one age. And I'm never mean, I'm just critical. So over time and with practice, and the practice part is important too, processing in this reading rope analogy becomes more tightly woven, all the skills tighten together, and as they're doing so, both the upper and lower bundles of strands are getting better in a new sort of meta way. Reading's becoming more purposeful, it's got a task, it's got a goal, you're building a schema, and you're monitoring your comprehension to make sure that you're on the right path and you aren't developing the wrong kind of schema. With regard to the word recognition strands, we all have these areas of automaticity where after doing something over and over and over correctly, you get fast, you get smooth, you get so effortless, you don't even realize you've read the cereal box. So driving and sports and knitting are other human activities like skilled reading that are done with a great deal of automaticity. Okay, case history. Again, I'm a developmental psychologist. We do case histories. I'm going to cover the birth of the rope, the prenatal environment, the early years, maturity, and RIP. Date of birth, approximately 1992. They didn't keep good records back then. So the thing is about 27 years old, which makes me feel really old. Labor was uneventful. It was done in a couple of hours. Pipe cleaners, pencil, graph paper underneath the other stuff, and then typed it up, the labels, and glued them on, and that's what's here. That's the original with the glued on labels, the one I signed. The inheritance is the really important part. The inheritance is scientific research. That's what this rope is the child of. There was a mountain of absolutely wonderfully rigorous work in the 1970s and 80s on every aspect of reading and reading disabilities. From people from all different fields, kind of the way it's blossoming today. And funding was so abundant that made that happen. I mean, really, it was a heyday of reading research, and it was exciting to be part of it. The prenatal environment is very important to understand because no rope would ever have been needed or existed if there had been consensus in the field about what the important aspects of reading are and how best to teach it. Because we were in the middle of the reading wars. And there's a few people gray enough out there that might remember the reading wars, but they truly were toxic. I put some of the names of the sinners, including some friends, up on there. And this is not made up. At conferences, they would yell these things to each other. So the whole language people referred to those people as fornicators, which is a good pun, but it's not nice. And they accused them of child abuse. Literally, it is child abuse to teach phonics. On the other hand, some of our colleagues were not that nice in return either. One famously threatening to burn down all the ed schools because that's where more of the whole language people were. And of course, the lack of scientific evidence on the part of the whole language people was a constant source of irritation when the systematic phonics people tried to argue with them. So that's where it was. And I will make a note, go to the AIM website. There's an article by Emily Hanford saying, hello, they're heating up again. You got to read it. Meanwhile, I just needed a handout. I was doing preschool research. But, they wanted me to come talk to parents and teachers about reading research, okay? And everybody knows that an audience wants a handout, and if you don't bring a handout, your rating goes down. I mean, it's just not done. I didn't bring one today. But I had to know about the reading wars to make sure I didn't offend anybody. That's where I was coming from. And it was that mindset that caused the rope to be made. The early years. Rope had a fulfilling life as a handout for parents and teachers at workshops that I led. Leslie Rescorla, who can't be here today because she's in Africa, lucky woman, she remembers seeing it for the first time at an Act 48 session at Bryn Mawr College in 1994. And I think it dates to about 92. The purpose was simply to illustrate to non-researchers what would be the lit review of an academic paper. And I think it succeeded because it's a metaphor, and it's a good metaphor, and it made sense to people of every stripe. I never met a whole language person who didn't say, yeah, that matters, that, yeah, we got to teach it all, that kind of thing. So it hit that. I'm a centrist, even though some of my friends are pretty radical. Not Ken, oh no. Maturity. The rope goes public. So, I don't know if you ever heard of Linnea Airy. She's a friend. She came back from a conference and said, Hollis, somebody gave a talk that I went to, some junior person, I don't know who, and she stood up and put up your rope and said it was Barbara Foreman's rope. So it's ego that forced me to publish it, because by golly, Barbara Foreman was not getting my rope. So I was writing this chapter at that time on early literacy, and I just stuck it in there as figure 1. And there's all, I think, 2 or 3 sentences about it in the whole chapter, but at least I got a, copyrighted publication out of the rope. And I have to say that ever since then, I receive about once a month an email inquiry asking to reproduce it, and 90% of the requests are to reproduce it for teacher training materials. So its original goal as a handout is still happening. It's just being done on a different scale. And I always say yes, unless you're a commercial enterprise, and then you have to go to Guilford, because they hold the copyright. Validity is important. We've had a lot of false alarms in the field of things being claimed that weren't true or they're only partially true. So even though I constructed the rope, there was no way to validate that I had the strands right. But I had, because I was a preschool researcher, I had gotten interested in prediction research, and I ended up doing a meta-analysis of the 61 available studies that had looked at the beginning of kindergarten at a whole host of predictor variables, and then waited till the end of 2nd grade and gotten outcomes. And in a meta-analysis, all you do is average the results over studies. There's nothing magical about the way I do it. The big math people do it very fancy, but this is not fancy. I'm just going to show you a chart of the average predictive strength of 16 different beginning of kindergarten predictors, and I don't think you'll be surprised. So, print skills predict print skills. What a shock, okay? And yet, people always forget to acknowledge that letter knowledge since about 1930s, first time it was ever measured as a predictor, has been the #1 predictor and probably always will be. It doesn't mean that knowing your letters is like, in itself, it's good, but it also is a surrogate for instruction before start of school. So, but it still predicts because instruction predicts. Concepts of print, ditto. But look at the next 3, which are the powerful ones. Not phonological awareness, that's number 3 actually, but they're all tied. Expressive vocabulary, sentence and story recall, which is sentence structures and syntax and semantics, and phonological awareness. So what made me happy was that they mapped so beautifully onto the rope strands. It's like, okay, that's where they came from a totally different data set to get the same factors being identified as the important ones. So we love that. Another thing in maturity that I was doing with the rope was to extend the metaphor and think about what its implications were for reading disability. And I got this wonderful graphic from Nancy Hennessy, and obviously the rope is made up of frayed strands, is not going to be as strong. It's still a great analogy. And the question was which strands, and some people are saying it was only the lower strands that produced reading disabilities, but hey, I knew that wasn't true because I did longitudinal work and followed kids, as I'll tell you in a minute. And so I did come up with, and I've never published this, but when I talked about the rope, I would say, okay, weaken one strand is going to cause a problem. The neighborhood strands are going to come down because of the interaction among the strands. So then you're going to have multiple strands, and that's going to be an even bigger problem. And if you start out with multiple strands, you're even in a bigger problem. And if they're really badly frayed, that's really bad. Frayed, I should say. Okay, they have a fancy name for that. The past 5 years, people are starting to call it a multifactorial model of reading disabilities. Woohoo! Okay. Okay. No, not that RIP. That RIP. So this Dilbert came out last month in the local paper, and I said, oh, that's me. I admit to ignorance about practice. Don't listen to Ken. I really don't know about the practical side, and I wouldn't dare to tell anyone in this room how to teach reading. It's just not, it would be rude. Okay. So I'm just going to say a few words about the rope and practice. Even if the rope is perfect, or any other metaphor or model or finding is perfectly apt for the situation, putting it into practice requires a whole other skill set and a whole other way of thinking that you are the people who have, not me. I'm just looking at that, and I'm a teacher. I'm going like, how do I know whether to teach background knowledge with vocabulary or separately? Do I do it more in 4th grade than 1st grade? This rope tells you nothing about how to teach these things, or when to teach these things, or with what to teach these things, and I can't help. Another thing, and Ron and I were talking about this a little bit, the rope was just about the reading piece in the kid's head. It was decontextualized from the larger problem of kids learning to read. All these people are photographing the screen. My email is going to be on there. I can send you the file. So there are all these other factors that influence reading so tremendously that aren't in the rope. And I have to tell you that at least 4 times a year, someone writes to me and says, I think you should have a strand for X. And I politely write back and say, I've thought about that, but no. Okay. Preschool experiences matter a lot. Conditions like specific language impairment, English second language, ADD, and other executive function weaknesses. Family history, big. Adequacy of prior instruction, big. You know the term curriculum casualties, I'm sure. Socioeconomic differences. Okay, that's one I can tell you something about. This is one of those findings that has been roundly ignored for 40 years by our community, even though it's a major finding with major implications for what we do. Most of you probably don't know that the socioeconomic status of a school is what matters, hugely. The socioeconomic status of a child's family, a little bit, not a big effect, okay? But many people don't know that, and they assume that somehow SES is in the child and causing the child to be negatively related to reading, when in fact it's going to a low SES school that is negatively related to reading. And it's so important. I gave Venn diagrams that didn't come out too well, but you can see there's about 50% overlap between average reading and average SES at the school level. At the level of the individual child, it's down to a 0.23 or 0.27 with only about 6% overlap. That's a really big difference in the effect of it. I read the White 1982, to be fair, is a long, boring article, very technical, and that's probably why it was ignored. You get punished for being really rigorous, right? But Sirin, in 2005, did a very nice modern redo, and I do recommend people read it if you're skeptical. Speaking of skeptical, I think one of the best things research can do is prune out the weeds in your garden. And I'm just going to put this out there. Did you know that rigorously obtained scientific evidence, some of it decades old, has indicated consistently that the following popular myths and long-standing ways of thinking are false? Bonding between infant and parent in the first days is crucial for a child's well-being. No. High sugar intake raises children's activity levels. No, not a shred. A common side of dyslexia is reversing letters. Nope, despite the big movie. Reading instruction is more effective if it is tailored to a child's particular learning style. That's a very popular one. Nope. Every decade, some scientists gains a great deal of renown for re-reviewing the evidence, the voluminous evidence against learning styles. And skilled readers don't actually read most of the words on the page because they can use context so effectively. If we could solve the question of why do people cling to myths despite clear science, and we know you do, I hit one of them for you. There's horrible data. I will say this, a recent poll showed that teachers are more savvy about this than the lay public. So there's, but everybody's pretty gullible. So I can't explain why we've had such slow progress toward evidence-based educational practice, but it's akin to the acceptance and persistence of those myths. Inertia's a big one. One of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain, "I'm all for progress. It's change I can't stand." Sound like any field you know? A lot of people point to shortcomings of teacher training. Some not very nice people point to shortcomings of teachers. Astute people realize that the definitive evidence for evidence-based education is awfully spotty at this point, but growing, and so much better than medicine, which is much less evidence-based than education, or at least reading education. And I would also add, although I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about it, poor communication skills of researchers. And probably all of the above is the answer. Which means kudos to AIM and everybody like AIM who is trying with the available data to become more evidence-based and not only move things forward, but as Ken said, give feedback back to researchers as to better questions to ask and times to ask them. All right. I got a lot of thank yous. Research is never, I once had rarely, I said no, never a solo enterprise. You just can't do it from a back room. So I have to thank a lot of people, starting with my mentor, Marty Brain, a pioneer in the study of language development, a good friend, a fellow sailor, and I was already a word nerd, but he really got me into that. Explains a lot. I went to NYU, as they can see by the lovely little violet flame. Leslie Rescorla picked up, she became my age mate, who with an equal passion for language and early language, and we've done a lot of work on that. My dear friend for many years is Marilyn Adams, and we disagree a lot, but we love to argue, so that works out. As you can see that when we go to conferences, we're very staid and sober, and we maintain a professional demeanor at all times. And Darian Griffin at AFT hates being photographed even more than I do. I've never been able to get a photograph of her. She and I began collaborating 20 years ago on dialect differences and have remained friends ever since. I have to thank JW, my nephew. You can see him at age 2, 42. In between, dyslexia. His family background, when I saw him as a toddler, his family background of reading disabilities became known to me through getting to know that family. But what I was really struck by, he had the strangest, most troubling early language at 20 months. And watching him gave me the inspiration, and he knows this, for the longitudinal study of preschoolers at risk for reading disability. As some of you may or may not know, throughout the state of New Jersey, we located 2-year-olds who had an older sibling or a parent with a pretty severe reading problem, and then we had matched kids, there were the controls, but otherwise similar, and we followed them from age 2 to age 14. So I did a lot of field research, and basically, yes, indeed, the at-risk youngsters showed deficits in pretty much every aspect of language and other things during their preschool period, although if you look at the middle page that accidentally got in with the rope stuff, so they put it up here, that shows how the particular aspect of preschool language changed from year to year. So if you looked at them at with some age, they look like they have a semantic vocabulary deficit. At another age, it looks like they have a syntax deficit. At another age, they have a phonological deficit. So it's very tricky to only look at one age. That's the message of that. So one of the things I'm proudest of is this study has been replicated around the world and done better each time by wonderful people from Finland to Australia. And everyone says, well, how did JW do? And he's making more money than a table full of you guys. He's in finance. He had a tough, K-12 because he really had it bad. But he was very smart, and he found ways like study groups where you only have to read 1/6 of the work, and other mechanisms for getting it in without reading. He is happily married, adores his 2 young daughters. They're too young to know yet whether any of them got the gene. And he's a decent reader, but he still can't spell at all. Nice guy, you'd like him. And of course, here we go. Look familiar? Haskins Lab has been my research home since 1996. And I picked this group photo from a symposium in honor of Don Shankweather in 2008, and he's in the front row there with his wife, Ruth. So there's Ken. The front row is the Haskins crowd. Ken, me hiding behind Ken, as I tried to do today, Carol Fowler, the president of Haskins before Ken, and Susan Brady, my dear colleague and friend. But I also have to give a shout out to our late colleagues, Ann Fowler and Len Cates, who are also integral to our research team and just wonderful people and so, so smart. Oh, there's some researchers in the background there. You might have heard of a few of them. They're pretty good people, but they're not from Haskins. As Ken said, half the fun of this game is the young'uns. And I had originally put young'uns on the slide until I realized they're all like 39 and up. So they're not that young'un anymore. But Lori Cutting, I had 3 slides on this, but they told me I couldn't talk that long. Lori Cutting's at Vanderbilt U in the psych department. She's doing fabulously. And she and I have done work mainly on comprehension, executive function, and neuroscience stuff. And I love her dearly. And she's a talker, and I'm a talker, so I'm prepared for a 2-hour stint. Coffee, already gone to the bathroom, because we're going to have a long conversation whenever we talk. John Sabatini, I've known for so long. I knew all these people, by the way, the year they finished their PhDs or the year after. So since they were brand new PhDs, John, we know when it had to have been, but we cannot recall where, whatever. But we've been working for a long, long time. He's at ETS. He's going to be speaking here in the summer. And we've mainly looked at adult literacy and some adolescent and models of the reading process. And Charity Hudley, when Darian and I were starting out on the dialect differences study, Bill LaBove said, "You have to hire Ann." I said, okay. It was the best advice ever. She's a dynamo. She's now at UC Santa Barbara. She's a sociolinguistics expert. And then, about a few years later, Nicole Patton-Terry showed up at Haskins as a postdoc and worked there for 2 years with me. And we took the dialect work even further in more interesting ways. And she's now, she's shifted last year to Florida State University and doing exceptionally well. I probably shouldn't say this, but one of the other things I'm really, really proud about is Ann and Nicole call themselves Hollis's girls, and they're very proud that I am the mentor of the only, according to them, the only 2 African-American women who achieved full named professorships at major universities before they were 40, which is like an awesome legacy. And Jen Leach works locally and knows some of you, and she and I worked on a very important paper on late emerging reading disabilities. And I want to skip to the bottom of this slide first. Back in the mid-90s is when I'm going to, maybe late 90s, some mystery educator came to, probably in Act 48, I know it was in Pennsylvania, and said, I got all these 5th graders coming into the clinic. They have impeccable histories through the primary grades, and now they can't read a lick. I don't know who it was. I would love to thank you in person. If you're here, let me know. If you know who it was, if you were there and know who it was, please let me know. That would be fabulous. Meanwhile, I am very deeply indebted to countless participants. We couldn't do anything if people, I did field research. They let us into our homes. It was, stressful, but I'm so appreciative of their patience and their generosity. The number of students and assistants that are responsible for all that data coming in is wonderful. the schools and teachers who are so generous and gracious. We were carrying out research in classrooms, hallways, nurses' offices, closets, stairwells, you name it, we collected data there because schools are pressed for space. Money makes the world go round. NICHD and some other federal agencies and the March of Dimes are the major funders for all the work I've done. Professional connections. The most, being a reading researcher doesn't pay that much, but the reward is the community of scholars that you're in, your fellow researchers, all those people I just mentioned, the broader community of people who love reading and reading research. And they also form groups. So this is going to be a surprise for the Dickmans. I think they're still here. Okay. New Jersey IDA was one such group for me, and Georgette and Emerson were, what? Where are they? Oh, okay. There they are. And I just appreciate that so much. And also through New Jersey IDA, I got to know Barbara Wilson, and I got to know Nancy Hennessy. That's where we go back to. And then SSR, which is the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading, probably introduced me to hundreds of researchers around the world, which is wonderful. And I'm going to just point out, too, Don Compton, who's already been mentioned, and Kate Kane. And the reason I picked those people with their pink arrows is they all connect to AIM. They're all on the Scientific Advisory Board of AIM. Small world. Did you realize that, right? And we all owe this huge debt of gratitude to AIM and to Nancy and Pat. Now, this award, it's mind-blowing. When you called me, I think I babbled because I was not making sense. I'm like, and I apologize for that. But it is just such an honor. I can't tell you how much it means to me. I really feel like I'm part of this AIM family now. And I thank you for finding me when I came down to Pennsylvania, because I'm a New Jersey person. And it's just one of the best things from my whole Pennsylvania experience. So, with that being said, that's how to find me. All right.
I do remember the day that I called Hollis and I said, if I could make people this happy by one phone call, I would do this every day of my life, because it was so much fun when she heard. She's like, really? And first she told me she was busy and she wasn't coming this year. I go, well, that might be a problem. So I am so glad that you rescheduled your event and came to us. So thank you, Hollis, for all that you've done, for everyone in this room, for all who are joining us virtually, as well as all children who are struggling readers. This means the world. So thank you. So right now, I am going to invite Nancy Hennessy and Ron Fairchild for a fireside chat. We didn't figure out how to put the fireplace up there, but we do want you to know this is going to be a dialogue back and forth about the opportunities and the obstacles of getting the research into the classroom. I shared with you that Nancy Hennessy has been instrumental in everything we've done here at AIM. And so to go through all of her accolades, it would be an entire speech like Hollis. So I'm so glad that you addressed her on that piece. For Ron Fairchild, we briefly heard him speak this summer, and we met him through the Tremaine Foundation because he is the senior consultant for the Capital Grade Level Reading Campaign. And so it is my pleasure to introduce both of these to experts in the field. They're out there. They have seen public schools. They have seen charter schools. They have seen private schools. We are all struggling with the same thing of how to get these readers and making them more proficient. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Nancy and Ron in the fireside chat.
Thank you. I think I... Let me put my glasses on or I'll be lost here. So this is a unique opportunity for us, Ron, huh?
It is,
Yeah.
it is. I think this is, I've spoken in many venues. I think this is my first fireside chat. I will confess I left my pipe and my smoking jacket at home, but it's kind of cold in here, so maybe just imagine that there's a fire here for us
we can do that.
to get warm. Yeah.
So we're going to share with you some perspectives on some topics that we've identified, some questions that we've identified, and really share with you from different perspectives. Of course, my perspective is coming from the educational community, and Ron from the organizational community.
Yeah, I think just to build on this metaphor, and it's an incredibly difficult challenge to follow the award presentation and Hollis Scarborough, but to build on that metaphor of that rope, I think in many ways, Nancy, you and I are going to be talking about the connection between classrooms and communities and the extent to which we need to do something analogous to pull the research that we've been talking about, make that more widely accessible and actionable, both in classrooms and in communities, because we need a broader movement around the principles that we've heard so much about this morning.
Absolutely. So perhaps we can begin by talking a little bit about what we perceive as obstacles to implementing the science.
Sure. I think we need to close the gap between what we know from the science and what we routinely do. And I have the great opportunity to work with a growing network of communities across this country, now close to 400 of them, that have put a stake in the ground about the importance of early school success and the importance specifically of these early measures of reading proficiency and math proficiency as some of the best predictors we have for future success in education. And I think the two biggest barriers that we hear about from communities are cynicism and complacency. The cynics are those who will tell you that we've tried all of this before in some form or fashion, it hasn't worked, therefore we should throw up our hands and say we can't hope for anything better. The complacent are the ones, frankly, who want to continue the status quo and are quite comfortable with the status quo. And what I was encouraged by this morning is a sense that we know a lot. There's a lot of science out there, and what I think we need to do is figure out a way that we can make this actionable, how we can mobilize a broader constituency of people who can really stand up and say, there is an urgent need to do something about the fact that only 20% of low-income kids in this country are reading proficiently by the end of third grade. This is an equity issue. It's the equity issue of our time. I am convinced of that. And we have a slow-moving crisis, a catastrophe on our hands in this country if we are content and resigned to the fact that 80% of our low-income kids are not going to achieve. And that's something that we simply cannot abide. And it is something against which we should rebel as a country.
Yeah, I certainly would agree with that. I often think about the fact that when we come to school as educators, administrators, what we care about are the students, and the students come first and foremost. And I think sometimes in our different worlds, what happens is our personal interests or philosophies become roadblocks, and we forget about what our mission actually is, and that is to educate all of our children. I'm also continually concerned about the fact that we as educators have not always had access to this knowledge base. I loved what you just said about, we know what to do, or we need to know what to do. And oftentimes when I work with teachers and talk with teachers, I talk about the fact that we have lots of programs that are available to us. We have the what, but we don't always understand why we're doing what we're doing. And we need to step back and think a bit about why would this or would this not work for the students that we currently have in front of us that we're working with. So this knowledge base is absolutely critical. I have spent a lot of time in schools, more recently as a consultant, but in the past actually working in schools. And there's a culture in schools that I believe is a barrier to providing what's the most effective instruction for children. It's a barrier that presents as a result of a lack of acknowledgement of the importance of professional learning and this connection to the science. So for me, those are some of the obstacles that I see.
Yeah, and I think as a former teacher myself, I think teachers really are looking for help that's legitimately helpful. And I think for far too long, we have laid the entire blame. We blame teachers for the situation that we've had with respect to reading proficiency in this country. And I think it's far easier to assign blame than it is to really step up and provide the kind of help and assistance and support that so many teachers and so many schools need. Now, I want to be clear, we have to get better at educating all of our children, all of the kids who show up to school. We have to get demonstrably better at that. But what we're seeing in communities is that when communities step up and say, there's something we can do before kids hit the first day of kindergarten to make sure that more kids are ready for school, that they're fully prepared to take advantage of what school has to offer. So when they get kids ready, that can be a huge help. When they make sure that kids are not chronically absent. We have far too many low-income kids, especially in this country, who are missing too much school in kindergarten, first, second, third grade, missing 20 or more days of school each of those 4 years, missing the equivalent of half a year of instructional time. And then we know that far too many kids are experiencing this setback during the summer, where they're not having exposure to enriching learning opportunities during the summer, during the after-school time. And those three things, when communities can step up and provide that kind of support to make sure more kids are ready, more kids are in school, more kids are experiencing the kind of enrichment that so many middle and upper income families routinely provide for those kids, that ends up being help that's actually helpful. It's help that's helpful to teachers and to schools who are about the core enterprise of teaching and learning. It gives all of us a fighting chance of moving the needle and getting a little bit closer to where we need to be. So I think it's going to take schools getting a lot better in the practice of teaching and learning, and also communities coming alongside of schools and making sure that more kids are positioned for success.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that there's that need for collaboration, not just within the schoolhouse, but outside of the schoolhouse as well. And I think that one of the things that can fuel that collaboration is the sharing of knowledge. You've just mentioned a number of things that we know about. The thing that we have to be thinking about is what do we do about that? Yeah. And I think an opportunity is to harness the energy of parents, of the community, as well as of educators. I've never met an educator that didn't come through the doors wanting to do well by their students. They want to be able to teach their students and have them succeed. What we need to do is provide the resources and the information necessary for everyone to be working on this particular problem.
Yeah. And similarly, I've never met a parent who didn't want their kids to succeed.
That's exactly
and
right.
I think we have to acknowledge our own complicity in a very troubling narrative about parents right now. And the way I would describe it is, it's a narrative that's basically ambivalence at best and judgment and blame at worst. And we have to be in a fundamentally different place if we're hoping to partner with parents. I think we need to meet parents where they are, help parents succeed in the critical work and the role and responsibility that they have in this core enterprise. I think for far too long, as schools and as teachers, we've talked about parent involvement and parent engagement. And usually the way that works is you engage or you get invited to be involved on my terms as a teacher or as a principal, versus really meeting parents and families where they are. And I think that that's really an incredible amount of work that we all have to do to undo and unravel some of the damage that that narrative has created.
Yeah. We have to remember that we come to the table as equals, each having a perspective to offer. But at the heart of that is, what do we want to do for this child? And if we can keep that in mind, I think we can overcome some of those barriers.
Absolutely.
It can't be a blame game. We can't blame our educators. We can't blame our parents. We have to recognize that we need to be partners in this because we want the same thing. Yeah.
And I think what we're all hungry for in this work is an enabling narrative, something that we know we can do to actually contribute to the problem. Because sometimes I think these problems feel like they're so big and so intractable that you almost feel powerless. But I think what we're seeing in communities across the country is that when you give people that sense that there's something that they can do, and when they're actually doing that thing, it will make a difference and it can contribute to real progress, then you start to sort of build a snowball effect, and people become more engaged and feel more empowered. And I think that it's critical that we as educators and leaders in our community create those opportunities for people to volunteer, to contribute time, to contribute energy and momentum and money to efforts that really stand a chance of succeeding.
I think that comes back to another topic that you and I had talked about, and that was, what are we doing to prepare our parents and to prepare our educators for working with these children before they even come to school? And Hollis, your work certainly has contributed to this, but we need more people to know about that work. We need to be working with our parents and with other partnerships and providing them with information that's plain talk. I mean, I remember a number of years ago sitting across from a parent, and I had done the diagnostic work for that child in a school system, and I was conveying the information to the parent. And of course, the parent started to cry. I started to cry. But not only was the parent crying because of hearing what I had to say about that child, but also because the parent really didn't totally understand what I was saying. I was speaking in my language. We have to find a common language. We need plain talk, so that if we want to give people tools and resources, then we have to actually give them tools and resources that they can understand and then implement.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to share, since we're in Pennsylvania, there are 6 Campaign for Grade Level Reading communities in the Commonwealth here, but one I wanted to focus on today is Philadelphia. And Jenny Bagoni, who heads up the Philadelphia campaign, it's called Read by Fourth. On your tables, you have a beautiful purple handout that describes, I think, just exactly what you were saying, Nancy, how you take some of this research, how you take what has really been done to really make a powerful case for what communities can do. They've made that actionable. So rewriting Philadelphia's early literacy story takes more than one author. And you see here, there's 6 bold ideas that are aligned with research, grounded in quality instruction that happens in the kindergarten through 3rd grade. They're making unprecedented investments in improving the quality of instruction, but also in mobilizing an entire community. This back page is one of the most impressive lists of partners that I have seen in any community across the country. The way they have mobilized and organized an entire community, not the least of which are the parents and community leaders. They have block captains, reading block captains across the city of Philadelphia. I've met moms and dads who are really taking this campaign and see it as their own, see it as something that they really feel a sense of ownership and responsibility about. And I would commend them to you as a wonderful example of what can be done when you leverage the power of community working together with schools to mobilize around this broader effort.
Yeah, so you're really speaking to the dissemination of the science, I believe, and using the science to guide what it is that everyone can do in terms of participation. Are there other ways that we can talk about how to disseminate the science more completely for educators, for parents, for community members?
Yeah. I think for a long time we've been, and it was interesting earlier this morning, I was listening to some of the questions that were asked, and several of you had questions about the program or the intervention that was being used, the type of tutoring program or model. And for a long time, we've had a very well-intentioned focus on evidence-based programs, almost an obsession, I would say, with evidence-based programs. And despite the strength of those individual programs and even the effect sizes, some of which we saw today, what we know about that, the inconvenient truth and reality of what we know about that is no single program, however effective, however impactful, is going to be what makes the difference for kids to get from below proficiency to above proficiency in reading. So the challenge, and I think the challenge of dissemination, is not just let's find the magic program, the silver bullet, the mystical incantation, the one thing that's going to work for kids, but it's about the sequencing of many interventions, the scope, duration, intensity of those programs over a period, over that developmental trajectory, such that we can have an assurance that enough of the right things are reaching enough of the right kids and families to move the needle at some kind of demonstrable level at the population level. We don't have that right now. I travel across the country looking for that. I travel to communities where they show me great programs that serve a few hundred kids. I see a wonderful summer program, a great after-school program, a great pre-K program, a great tutoring program. None of those programs are aggregated or concentrated on enough of the kids and families who need those touch points. That's why I'm so excited about a campaign strategy like the one in Philadelphia, where you can start to concentrate that stuff, because this sort of wide dissemination of lots of different programs and everyone's doing this sort of mad search for the one right thing isn't going to get us there. We have got to be far more disciplined about it, but we've got to approach this thing like a pipeline where we can sequence these things very carefully. That takes work. We don't typically have the funding necessary to do that hard work. We can get program money from funders to support that. We have to create the space that allows program providers to work together and to knit those things together very carefully.
I'd like to just come back to also the consumer's perspective in terms of program. I don't always think necessarily of specific programs. I think about principles of instruction and the components of instruction. And certainly the Reading Rope has provided guidance, as has the research of many others, including the individuals we heard from today. So thinking about what does it take for a student to become proficient in reading? At what point do we address the various strands of the rope? All right, how do we make good decisions about whether or not the student has actually become automatic? What are the principles of instruction that work best? We heard Doug Fuchs talk today about explicit instruction. I mean, certainly those of us who work in the field of reading are very focused on thinking through how we can deliver programs that align with what we call structured literacy to our students. So having that basis, I think, or that foundation is incredibly important as educators, administrators, consumers of these products begin to make decisions about the products. It starts there. I always like to think about the fact that we need our theoretical models, we need our research to guide what it is that we're doing in our practices. There's a beautiful quote in, it's Rayner's quote in The Voice of Evidence, "If not research, then what?" And that is what should be guiding the decision making that we're all engaged and involved in as we think about multiple products.
And Nancy, I know so much of your work is at the level of practice.
Yes.
And I think we should distinguish between what is a packaged program and trying to scale individual packaged programs and scaling strategies and practices. And I think that holds a lot of promise, both inside classrooms, but also the kind of practices and strategies that we would see more broadly across a community that wants to support literacy before school starts, in the after school hours, in the summertime, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I'm not thinking about specifically a program again. I'm thinking about what's the foundational knowledge. For instance, before children come to school, how language is critical throughout school. We saw some evidence of that today in talking about language comprehension for math. I had not thought about that before, but now I will be thinking about it. But thinking about development of language early on, the oral language, and then continuing that through school.
Yeah. What I thought about as I was listening to Lynn and Doug this morning is, the sort of old model was that there was somehow inside the brain a math processor that kind of sat over here. And then you did reading somewhere else. And social emotional development, well, that's something entirely different. And what we know from the MRI imaging and all of those pieces that these things are inextricably linked and connected. Even the traditional left brain, right brain stuff we saw in the imaging this morning. The right brain and the left brain, the hemispheres are both implicated.
They're working
now,
together.
I was kind of intrigued by the gray matter development of the London taxi cab drivers. And I thought as I was driving in on the Pennsylvania Turnpike this morning that maybe we should do some work on that here. But I just think that these issues, until and unless we can kind of think holistically about proficiency being both reading and math, and thinking about the effects of trauma-informed practice, social emotional development, our progress, we're only going to get so far until and unless we address some of those things.
I think it becomes more and more evident to all of us that we all need to be omnivores, right? That we need to continually learn. That really, here at AIM, we've talked a long time about learning is our work. It's not just the work of students, it's all of our work. It's the work of parents, community members, educators, and so on. There's so much that we know, but there's so much more that we need to learn. And in terms of reading and math, you were just talking about reading and math, the importance of us to continue to think about what are the processes, what are the skills that overlap? How do we address these in a way that students don't feel like they learn something here, and then they learn something here, and then they learn something here, and none of it connects? I mean, personally, I was sitting here this morning thinking, language comprehension, strand of the reading rope. Well, when I think about language comprehension, I think about reading comprehension. I think about, how do we go about framing instruction for reading comprehension? And yet it was very clear to me this morning in the conversation that sentence comprehension might be important in math, that the use of what we call cohesive ties, those pronouns that Doug was talking about, are important. So making these connections, I think, is absolutely critical. And having not only our educators understand that, but as you said, our community members, organizations such as yourself, all of us having shared knowledge about the complexity of learning.
Yeah. I'm curious about what structures you've seen, both in schools and within districts, that promote that kind of sharing, that boundary breaking kind of sharing of practice that could really have the potential to spread and to scale.
Yeah. Well, I think it always goes back to understanding that there is this language literacy connection. And I think it begins there. So thinking about the different systems of language, whether it be phonology, morphology, semantic syntax, and then thinking about the components of instruction and how one influences the other. I think that's the starting point. And then teachers that understand that are able to integrate that into their instruction, much as both Lynn and Doug Fuchs were speaking to embedding that within instruction. yes, we need direct, explicit instruction in terms of language structures, but then we have to look for these opportunities to embed that kind of instruction. So kind of cross-pollinate.
Yeah, and have you seen it where that kind of cross-pollination extends beyond the traditional school day and year into like a well-intentioned community organization that wants to do an after-school and summer program to reinforce what happens during the regular school day and year?
I've not personally seen that, but I think that would be critical.
Yeah.
You know, oftentimes when I think about readiness skills for students, preschool children, I think there's a lack of understanding of the importance of language and the development of language. So I think it would be, and again, this I think should be a goal of ours, to be sharing this kind of information across grade levels and with different constituencies.
Right. And we're starting to see a blurring of some of those traditional boundaries where pre-K educators and kindergarten through third grade teachers are coming together for some joint professional development. Sometimes their after school and summer program providers are being invited into that, and so they're getting access to the kind of rich professional development and support that traditionally might only be available to K-3 public school teachers.
In some instances, but again, I think an obstacle for all of us has been the fact that we don't have a belief system, I don't believe, in our schools that professional learning is part of our everyday work for educators. So I think it's important, yes, to include teachers, you know, pre-K and preschool providers, but I think it's also important for us to be focusing on our educational community and reasserting the fact that we need to be learning every single day. It's not about one workshop. It's not about, this is a wonderful, wonderful conference, but we need more than this. We need a continuum of opportunity.
Yeah, I like what Doug had to say about the mark of an excellent researcher is curiosity.
Yes.
And I would say that I might extend that a little bit to say that the mark of a great teacher, or the mark of a great professional, really is this idea that you're going to continue to learn. And one reason I love being here today is that sense of being able to be exposed to new research, to learn from and with all of you. So it's been an honor.
Yeah, I think also knowing what the resources are, and you just spoke to the efforts here in Philadelphia and providing those resources, but also for us educationally, knowing that there are resources through, for instance, the Institute of Educational Science, wonderful practice guides. There are individuals in this room who've contributed to those practice guides, and that provides information not about a program per se, but direction for, guidelines for how we go about educating students in reading, math, and writing at different age levels. So how do we break down these silos?
Well,
what do we do?
I think it does take communities coming together and saying, you know, we are going to mobilize a wider group of partners. And with the campaign, we call it sort of a big tent coalition. Typically comes together, one organization will say, we'll be in the lead. We have a number of different types of organizations. In Philadelphia, it's the library. In other communities across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there are United Ways, other community organizations that often set the table to bring people together to say that there is something that uniquely communities can do to work with schools to make sure that more kids are successful in the early years and the early grades. We need a plan. All of our communities typically take between 3 to 6 months to develop what we call a Community Solutions Action Plan. That plan then gets implemented, and we're beginning to see real measurable progress across the country on these indicators of school readiness, improved school attendance, reduced setback during the summer months, and improvement on overall measures of third grade reading proficiency. So it seems to be bearing out. You know, this is one of the challenges about third grade reading, is that it is a lagging measure. It takes time to show real significant impact on that, and often in education we don't tend to have the patience to stick with something for a long period of time. We tend to gravitate toward the new and bright and shiny thing. And what we're seeing in communities is this effort to really double down and to stay the course and stay focused on this, and to move the needle on a lagging indicator in order to keep people at the table and having the patience for one of those metrics that might take 4, 5, 10 years to move. You have to have leading indicators that you can show progress on in a year or two. And that's what we're seeing with some of the measures around school attendance, some of the measures around reductions in summer learning loss and things like that. They are signs of hope and signals of progress that keep people focused and keep their attention on an issue like this when there are so many other issues competing for a share of attention.
Yeah, so you've mentioned just now and previously some of these other factors that play into students attaining reading proficiency, math proficiency. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on some of those? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So with the campaign started in 2010 with the publication of a report by the Annie E. Casey Foundation called Early Warning. And in that report, we outlined 3 core assurances that would need to be met in order for large numbers of low-income kids to be reading proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. The first is quality teaching in every setting, in every context, the kind of quality teaching that we're talking about, direct, explicit instruction, high-quality instruction in literacy, both in school, but also the kind of quality instruction that you would want to see at home in early childhood programs and across every setting and every context that kids are in. So that's the quality teaching, and we understand that that is critically important. Second is a more seamless system of care and support for kids and families across the birth to 3rd grade spectrum. And we know right now, if you try to navigate our current systems of support and care, as a family would navigate them, it's incredibly challenging. We have a lot of gaps in our systems, we have a lot of disconnects, and we need to do a better job of making that more seamless and more integrated. And third, there are these community solution areas of school readiness, school attendance, and summer learning that until and unless we address those issues at scale, we're only going to get so far with our efforts to improve literacy outcomes. So those are sort of the 3 assurances that kind of framed the overall campaign. And that, I think, in large part explains why so many communities mobilized around it, because we did a lot of listening and learning and talking with community leaders who described some of the work that they were already doing.
And can you describe for all of us some of the partners that you have in this campaign? Because you've talked a great deal about community involvement, and Philadelphia certainly, but it would be interesting for all of us to understand who are these partners? Who are you working with?
Sure. So there are more than 390 communities in 44 states that are involved in the campaign, more than 4,100 local organizations that are part of local sponsoring coalitions. They are led by, each coalition has a designated community lead. They're often led by local funders. The local philanthropic community has been incredibly engaged and supportive of the campaign. We have United Way organizations who are leading campaigns. We have library systems. We have nonprofit organizations, public agencies, faith community. It's really designed to be a big tent, multi-sector coalition that really attracts and brings on new constituencies. The one critical partner, I'll mention 2 that have been really transformative for us. One is public housing authorities, to actually bring learning and bring literacy support home to where low-income struggling readers, not surprisingly, are overrepresented in the population of kids who are in public housing authorities, who are in Section 8 housing, and really strong partnerships are emerging between housing and education. I think that that's a powerful point of intersection. Another one is in the health community. And so bringing together health and education. We talk a lot about the health determinants of early school success. A lot of people are on the social determinants of health, and on that issue, we talk about the health determinants of early school success being things like vision, hearing screenings, the kind of comprehensive developmental screening, the kinds of things that happen during well baby checkups, the need for more kids to be involved in making sure that you get a comprehensive developmental screening, that screening results in some referrals, and those referrals actually result in treatment. And we've seen a groundswell of support from the public health community around this issue. I was just in Atlanta, Georgia recently, and just to give a concrete and specific example of the power of this stuff, I had an opportunity to visit with some folks from Grady Hospital, which is the downtown hospital in the center of Atlanta. And at Grady Hospital and other hospitals, they're changing the standard of care for what a successful birth is. And they say that a successful birth at Grady Hospital is not just the absence of bad health outcomes, but it's the presence of language nutrition given to kids and their families, so that every staff person in the birthing unit of that hospital has gotten training in how to do serve and return, the importance of talking, reading, singing with babies. And so you see staff people, nurses, doctors, everyone who touches the family is interacting with the babies, talking and singing and reading to the babies in the way that parents want to model that for parents, so that it's not enough just to make sure the baby leaves the hospital in a car seat that's buckled in. It's that the baby leaves the hospital with parents who have some training and some understanding, even at a basic level, that it's important to talk and to read and to sing to your kid. That's the kind of power that I think we can see when community really embraces the spirit of what the brain science is really sharing with us.
That's really bringing the science to practice, and in this case, the parents' practice, right?
Yeah, you see that, you can imagine the brain imagery of that baby just lighting up, firing, and that's what we want to see.
The importance of developing language early on.
Yep.
So specifically, how
I think our time is up.
Our time is up?
We're getting the very polite signal that our time is up.
All right, I'll say one last thing. You mentioned something about looking for results and waiting 5 to 7 years, and I think that's important for us to reiterate here for the educational community as well. So often what we want to do is jump from one program to another, one initiative to another, and the implementation science clearly tells us that we have to develop competency, we need leadership, we need the kind of culture that supports structural change, and it is not going to happen overnight, so we need to be patient with this. Thanks so much, Ron. This was a pleasure.
It was fun.
That back on? Working, not working? Hello? Yes, okay. Just before introducing our last speaker, I wanted to briefly mention I was linking two things that had happened. Dr. Scarborough mentioned that she's a collector of quotes, and I thought something among the very impressive things we heard during the fireside chat, Nancy Hennessy mentioned something about the importance of theory for guiding certain decisions and so on. And if you've never heard a quote before from the psychologist Kurt Lewin, or you might say Lewin, L-E-W-I-N, nothing is so practical as a good theory. Think about that for a while. Sounds like an oxymoron, but isn't. Now, to introduce our last speaker, this is Dr. Nancy C. Jordan. She's the Dean Family Endowed Chair of Teacher Education and professor at the University of Delaware. Her research interests are in children's mathematical development and learning disabilities. In particular, she is doing research on the development of early number sense, how children learn fractions and connections between mathematics and reading difficulties. She has developed successful math screeners and interventions for high-risk children. Professor Jordan has received research funding from NICHD, from the Institute of Education Sciences, and the Spencer Foundation. She is author or co-author of many articles in children's math and has recently published articles in Child Development, the Journal of Learning Disabilities, Developmental Science, Developmental Psychology, and the Journal for Research in Mathematics Education, among many others. Professor Jordan holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Iowa, where she was awarded Phi Beta Kappa, and a master's degree from Northwestern University. She received her doctoral degree in education from Harvard University and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago. Before beginning her doctoral studies, she taught elementary school children with learning disabilities. Recently, Professor Jordan served on the Committee on Early Childhood Mathematics of the National Research Council of the National Academies and on the panel of the Institute of Education Sciences Practice Guide on Teaching Math to Young Children. She serves on the editorial boards of several research journals and is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. The title of her talk is Living on the Number Line, Development of Fraction Magnitude Understanding in Children at Risk for Learning Difficulties in Mathematics.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. It's a pleasure to be here and to learn about the AIM Academy and the wonderful evidence-based work that you're doing. It's just a model for effective practice, and also to be a part of the celebration for the amazing Hollis Scarborough. So it's just been, last night was great, and today has been really wonderful. So I thought maybe I'd just start out with this little Peanuts cartoon and have you all think about what it was like when you had to learn fractions, or when your children or your students had to learn fractions. I think it evokes a lot of negative feelings in a lot of people, but it really shouldn't, and I'll tell you why. Okay, in terms of just the broader impacts of problems with math, the recent US Nations report card showed that just 33% of 8th graders nationwide scored at or above proficiency in math, with the situation being most dire for non-Asian minorities, for low-income students, and students with disabilities. You can see that only 13% of Black children and 19% of Hispanic children were proficient in 8th grade. Among low-income students, only 13% were proficient, and among students with diagnosed disabilities, many of whom probably are the populations that you serve, only 9% were proficient. Now, fractions are a really important part of math education because they are foundational for learning algebra and pre-algebra, which starts in 7th and 8th grade. And so it really is a critical component of math education in the intermediate grades. And even weaker students that you might have who aren't going to go into math-related fields, they need to understand fractions and additional math to contribute successfully to the future workforce. And then, of course, facility with fractions affects our daily life functioning in many areas, such as food preparation, preparing personal finances, determining mortgage rates, doing home repairs, and even making healthcare decisions. So fractions and later consequences for learning mathematics are serious. Now, on the other hand, fractions are very hard. It's understandable why children have trouble learning fractions. Numbers of the same magnitude could look very different. For example, 3/4 equals 9/12. And then sometimes when the numerals of a fraction of a denominator get bigger, the fraction gets smaller. 1/4 is bigger than 1/8. But this isn't always the case. You need to determine the relation between the numerator and the denominator. And then there's an infinite amount of numbers between two fractions. So on and on it goes. Now I'm going to, some of the focus of today is on the number line, and I'm going to show you why the number line is so important for learning math in general and fractions in particular. But mathematician Richard Askey told my colleague Russell Gersten, mathematicians spend most of their lives living on the number line. And mathematician Wu observes that the number line should be central to teaching of fractions in the intermediate grades. Why is the number line important for magnitude understanding and fraction learning? Well, numerical development is a continuous process that broadens the class of numbers that are seen as possessing magnitudes that can be represented on the number line. And this includes whole numbers, fractions, decimals, positive, negative numbers, and so on. And number lines therefore broaden the concepts of fractions in ways that the traditional part-whole representations that are often used in fraction instruction can't. And over-reliance on these kinds of part-whole interpretations can lead to narrow thinking about what fractions represent. For example, in our studies, when we've asked children, what's a fraction, some will respond, a fraction's a pi, or it's the shaded part, which is a very limited idea of what fractions are. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about our Delaware longitudinal project, which generously was supported by the US Department of Education, IES. And this project was done in collaboration with Lynn Fuchs and Bob Siegler, so shout out to them as well. But in the Delaware piece of the project, our aims were to identify predictors of fraction learning from 3rd through 6th grade. And this is such an important period because it's the period when the bulk of fractions instruction takes place in school. And then we wanted to be able to explain, start to understand why so many students struggle with fractions. And then another thing we were interested in is connections between math and reading fluency, since we're looking at children longitudinally. And to understand or to identify patterns of growth and fraction learning. And then based on our findings, this was just the most amazing part of our project, was to be able to develop and test an intervention to help children learn fractions. So we started at the end of that project, and then I'll tell you about a new grant where we've really been able to examine this in detail. Our overarching hypotheses were that accurate representations of numerical magnitudes on the number line are uniquely important for acquiring fraction knowledge. And to test this premise, we examined the extent to which domain general, Dan talked about a little bit earlier, and number-specific cognitive processes predict fraction outcomes. And then to develop an intervention focused on understanding of fraction magnitudes plus general learning principles, which I'll describe later, we thought that would be especially important for improving at-risk learners' knowledge of fractions. So our longitudinal sample consisted of 536 students, as I said, whom we followed between 3rd and 6th grade. They were drawn from 9 elementary schools and 2 public school districts in Delaware. And we did oversample children from, as Hollis mentions, it's the community, not so much the school. So we oversampled children from low-income communities who might be at risk. This is just a, if you're interested, if you have the printouts of the slides, this is our sample demographics. And basically what you can see here is that it's a pretty representative population, except we do have more children than is typical from low-income backgrounds. So we had predictor variables, which served as the independent variables in our project, things we wanted to look at to see if they would predict fraction learning. And we put in these variables based on the research literature. And as we talk a lot about language is important, so we measured verbal ability. We measured that in 3rd grade, as well as nonverbal ability, because that clearly is an aspect of mathematics. We looked at attention, and this was in all grades. We had teachers rate the students' attention in math class. Working memory, as you guys have already heard about a lot today. We looked at that in 3rd and 5th grade. And we looked at children's reading fluency in all grades using the test of word reading something, the tower. And that was just like reading individual words within 45 seconds. And I'll show you some of these measures in a second. In terms of the number-related predictors, Dan had already showed you an example of whole number line estimation. I'll show you that again. Calculation fluency, which was addition, subtraction, and multiplication fluency in all grades. We also looked at children's non-symbolic proportional reasoning in 5th grade. We only did it in 5th grade because we didn't know about the task. When we assessed the kids in 3rd grade, we discovered it later, so we thought, well, at least we'll put it in. And then a measure of long division. And then we also, in our models, we included background variables of age, school district, gender, special education status, and so forth. This is, again, is an example of the whole number line estimation task. The child, and Dan showed you this earlier, that the child was basically supposed to estimate where, and I think, Dan, you did that. You did it correctly on the number line earlier. And then these are the actual numbers that the children were asked to estimate. And it's kind of an abstract task in some ways. And when we first started out, I wasn't quite so sure how well this task would work, but it really yielded a lot of interesting information. This is a non-symbolic proportional reasoning task, and it was adapted from a study by Boyer and Levine. And basically we said, here is my friend Harry the Hawk. Harry enjoys drinking all kinds of juice and likes to mix the juice himself. Harry must be careful to have the correct mix of water and juice for each type of mix. Which of these two would taste just like Harry's juice? So in the first one, this was the stimulus, and then the child had to decide whether it's this one or this one. And the correct answer, of course, is this one. Even though it's a different size, the proportion is about the same. The second type of task had discrete markings. So this was the same instructions, but the child had to determine which had the same proportion. But the thing that's a little bit different on this one, if you guys think about the strategies you might use for this task, it's really kind of easy to count on that and to convert to fractions. And actually, research has found that young children are better at this type of task because especially children with math disabilities, they get messed up with counting. They actually have some good intuitive reasoning ability, but when they start, bringing counting into the mix, they make mistakes. Now, with our kids who are in 5th grade, they did about the same on both, so we included both types of tasks in our analysis, but this is probably the purer task of proportional reasoning. Our fraction concept outcome measures, which I will show you, included fraction concepts, mainly taken from the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, released items. And we used fraction number line estimation task and fraction arithmetic. And all of these measures were given over multiple points between 4th and 6th grade. We didn't start in 3rd grade because children really hadn't had much fractions instruction in 3rd grade. Okay, in terms of the fraction concepts, we had things like this, which shows 3/4 of the pictures shaded, so they had to pick the one. That was area models and set models. This was an interesting item because we asked the child to shade the set of figures that's the amount indicated by the fraction next to it, which would be 4/5. And what makes this problem a little bit challenging is the number of circles does not match the number in the denominator. And I'll show you in a bit some of the mistakes that children make on that type of item, but it really requires understanding of fractions. In terms of number lines, we had an item like this where the child had to, just show where 1/2 is. We would show where 1/2 is, and the child would have to indicate where 3/4 is. Comparing fractions, they have to order the fractions from least to greatest, which is hard for all students, not only students with learning difficulties. Equivalence. These three fractions are equivalent. Write two or more fractions that are equivalent to these so that we were able to look at the errors that the child made. And then they were also asked to estimate which fraction has a value closest to 1/2. So these are very curriculum type fraction concepts items. The fraction number line task was parallel to the whole number line estimation task. And we use 0 to 2 and 0 to 1 number lines. The 0 to 2 number line is a little more challenging because they have to really think about fractions that are improper where the numerator is larger than the denominator. Keep in mind on these number line estimation tests when I show you the data that the smaller the number, the closer you are to the correct answer, the more accurate you are. So the lower the score, the better on these types of items. And then our fraction arithmetic task was just a standard, computational task where kids had to compute with fractions. Okay, I have another slide explaining this, but these are the multiple regression standard beta coefficients, which are basically effect sizes of predictors of fraction concepts in arithmetic by grade. And what you can basically see here first, which is highlighted in green, that the whole number line estimation in 3rd grade is a really strong predictor, and it's negative because the smaller number, the better. It's really predictive of both fraction concepts in arithmetic in 3rd as well as 6th grade. But nevertheless, there's a constellation of other domain general and domain specific skills that also predict fraction concepts and fraction arithmetic. And things that seem to be especially important would be the non-symbolic proportional reasoning for concepts, and of course attention, classroom attention that was rated by the teacher in 3rd grade is still predicting things out through 6th grade. But the summary of that analysis that I just showed you is that together, and I'm going to talk just about the 6th grade data, what's predicting 6th grade. The predictors explained about 58% of the variance in 6th grade fraction concepts, and independently important were. That means when we have all of those predictor variables in the model, the ones that were significant made a unique contribution holding constant all of the others. So it isn't just like they're measuring the same thing and that's why they're coming out significant. So the things that were independently important were whole number line estimation, as I mentioned, non-symbolic proportional reasoning, attention, working memory, which we've heard a lot about today, and long division. But again, that's 58% of the variance, which would be then another 42% of the variance that's unexplained, which could be explained by classroom instruction, emotional issues, and so on. And then the predictors only explained about 40% of the variance in the fraction procedures, which is the fraction arithmetic, with attention, once again, number line estimation, multiplication, fact fluency, and long division, all making independent contributions. Since we are really interested and we're talking about connections between reading fluency and math fluency today, 3rd grade reading fluency uniquely predicted fraction concepts, but in 4th grade, but not arithmetic, and then it didn't predict out to 6th grade, but I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So, the implications of this piece of the longitudinal study is that a constellation of processes influences fraction learning, including numerical magnitude understanding, arithmetic fluency, attention and memory, and reading and language skills. And developing an accurate representation of whole number magnitudes on the number line seems to provide an organization for reasoning and thinking about fraction magnitudes. And as I mentioned, unobserved variables, things that we weren't able to explain everything, for the remaining invariants could include instructional and emotional influences. So thinking about the relation between word reading fluency and calculation fluency between 3rd and 6th and 5th grades, it was a really interesting study. We found significant effects of reading fluency on multiplication fluency, but not on addition or subtraction fluency. And of course, multiplication fluency didn't affect reading growth. So what there was a direct effect of multiplication early in 3rd grade, of reading fluency early in 3rd grade. So if you start out 3rd grade and you're a fluent reader, you're more likely to be fluent with your multiplication facts at the end of 3rd grade. And this is interesting because it's the 3rd grade is the period where kids are starting to learn multiplication, and children that come to 3rd grade or are fluent at the beginning of 3rd grade are much more likely to become fluent, and also then it predicts how they will grow, how they will develop multiplication fluency between 3rd and 5th grade. And so we think that the reason it's predicting, reading fluency predicts multiplication fluency, but not addition and subtraction fluency, is that multiplication facts are often learned through rote memory, and which would lead to increased reliance on written materials to learn multiplication. Whereas addition and subtraction, when children start learning addition and subtraction, it's typically in kindergarten, even early 1st grade, and they're not even reading yet. So they're learning through a lot of oral activities, and they can use strategies, mental strategies, to get the answers. There aren't nearly as many addition and subtraction combinations as there are multiplication facts. So they learn to count on from an addend, or to think about addition and subtraction, and so on. But by the time they get to 3rd grade and they're learning multiplication, they're already reading. And I think a lot of teachers, we suspect a lot of teachers probably use, and I have a picture of this at the end of the presentation. I wasn't sure I'd had time to show it, but that they might use like written materials for the kids to just memorize large numbers of multiplication tables. And so there aren't as many kinds of adaptive strategies that kids can use efficiently and quickly. So that's why sometimes in some of our earlier studies, we'll see kids who, with reading disabilities, and they do quite well until 3rd grade. We think, oh, they're fine in math. And then 3rd grade, they start to stumble, and they start to stumble, and then the problems can cascade because multiplication is such an important fact of learning fractions, because fractions obviously involve multiplicative reasoning. So I don't know why this is like moving around so much. Okay. So basically then I wanted to also talk about this fraction number line estimation growth. So we looked at growth of fraction magnitude skills between 4th and 6th grade. The good news is we found most kids do increase in their estimation accuracy. However, we did these kind of sophisticated statistical analyses where we were able to uncover distinct growth classes. And we found 3 of those, and let me show you what they look like. And again, remember that the colors don't, these would be the best kids here. So here we are, their accuracy in the winter of 4th grade, they're pretty accurate. And by the end of 6th grade, they continue to be accurate. Then there's these kids who start out kind of highly inaccurate in the fraction estimation, and through instruction, they learn a lot and they get close to the highly accurate kids by the end of 6th grade. But these are the children who represent 33% of our population who basically went through 4th and through 6th grade and they learned nothing about fraction magnitude estimation. They stay highly inaccurate throughout the study period, even though presumably they've been getting a lot of instruction. So what's going on here? We looked deep, we wanted to dig more deeply, And first of all, we were thinking, okay, we have lots of different types of fractions kids were looking at. They're proper. Mathematicians don't really like this use of improper, but most of you can relate to that. Proper, which would just be the fractions where the numerator is smaller than the denominator. Improper, and then mixed fractions. So just keep that in mind as we're thinking about the fractions on the number line. So we decided to do an item analysis and to see what the kids looked like. And so if on the vertical axis is their estimation accuracy, where they estimated, and on the horizontal axis is where the number actually should have been placed. Now this is class 1. These are these amazing kids who they start out in 4th grade. They're really good at this task, and by the end of 6th grade, they're great. Look at it, pretty much goes in a straight line up. It's very linear, which means they're almost perfectly accurate. And like doing those kind of fine estimations by the end of 6th grade. Now these kids, you can see they're, kind of look fairly random at the beginning of 4th grade, and they get increasingly linear by the end of 6th grade on the various problems. But again, here's these class 3 kids that are inaccurate, and what you can see is that if you look at the improper fractions that are more than 1, you can see that they are estimating those as being less than 1. They basically, in this group, they tend to see all fractions as being less than 1. So basically that's the point. We did find younger kids and lower performing students tend to see fractions as being less than 1, and they fail to base their estimates based on the relation between the numerator and the denominator. And it's not surprising. I mean, when we talk about a fraction of a second or something like that, people just think of fraction has to be something really small. And this could be related to the emphasis on proper fractions in early math instruction, which might have implications for getting kids to think more broadly about fractions. And here's some examples of misconceptions, like 19, because 19 is a bigger number. They put a 1/19 closer to 1. 1/4 they put closer to 0 than, or they put it farther away from 0 as 1/4. And then a lot of kids, they didn't really pay attention to the ends of the number line. This is 0 to 1, this is 0 to 2, and this one, they get it kind of correct by chance. They just go half in the middle of the line, whereas here they're still putting half in the middle of the line because they're not thinking about, okay, this would be 0 to 1, and then actual 1/2 would be there. So it gave us some clues about the kinds of misconceptions that the students have. And then I also just wanted to show you this to show that these misunderstandings are important. They have some practical implications. When we controlled for cognitive and background variables, we found that those growth classes predicted math achievement on a state test at the end of 6th grade. So these higher kids, 68% of those kids that were high and stayed high in fraction magnitude, they were advanced on the PSSA the Delaware math state test, and 26% met the standard, very few were below the standards, and then these kids who started inaccurate and ended inaccurate, the majority of those children were below standards or well below the standards, and these kids kind of like fell in the middle, just like those lines showed that they might have started out weak, but they were able to benefit from instruction. So the implications here are a substantial number of students enter middle school without basic understanding of fraction magnitudes on the number line, despite several years of instruction that was aligned with the Common Core state standards. Our school districts had bought into the standards then and were providing supposedly conceptual instruction. And then on the other hand, some students enter 4th grade with strong understanding of fraction magnitudes, and we're kind of interested in how children develop these intuitions, like looking at the strong students, and maybe we can discuss that later. I'd be interested in hearing what you guys think. And in terms of the developmental progression of some of the other fractions tasks, these are some examples of what children do. This is one child, and these are longitudinal for the same child across the different grades. For 4/5, here they kind of got the idea of 4, and then they tried to, I don't know, they were trying to divide up the individual circles. Here was more the standard error, just looking at the numerator, and then by 5th grade got it right. Here the child in 3rd grade just, did the 4/5, again, just looked at the numerator. Here we're not positive, but it looks, sometimes kids add those together, and that's how they got 9. So they just, okay, we have 2 numbers, at least they're thinking that, there's 2 numbers you have to consider. And then by 5th grade, got it right. And these are the percentages of what our sample does in general. And then here's some other examples of finding equivalent fractions. This child in 4th grade basically didn't know what to do, so just gave reciprocals, and thinking that they're equivalent, it has the same numbers, but you change them around. In 4th grade was partially right, and then by the spring of 5th grade got them. But still, by the spring of 5th grade, 21% of kids still are having trouble with that type of item. Again, showing some of these basic misunderstandings that children have that can become pretty entrenched. So then this leads us to our intervention. We were just very excited to have the opportunity to develop a fraction sense intervention for children with or at risk for math difficulties. Some of you guys might have heard my colleague and former student, Nancy Dyson, who was here a few years ago, talking about our early number sense intervention. Well, now we're still working on that, but it's also very excited to be dealing with fractions as well. So this is our theory of change. I won't spend, again, you can look at the slides. You have copies of those, or you can write me for these. But this is our basic theory of change that we have, that our target population was 6th graders because our study ended in 6th grade, and we thought, okay, there are a number of students in 6th grade who are still struggling. Our fraction sense components were like understanding the meaning of a fraction, thinking about fraction relations, fraction operations. I'll show you our approach. And then we thought the underlying cognitive numerical processes would be this numerical magnitude understanding is important, and then of course proportional and multiplicative reasoning. Our proximal outcomes would be improving fraction concepts, arithmetic and fluency, and then our distal, our further outcomes, we hoped by providing this intervention, we would improve math achievement more generally, algebra readiness, and then of course, improve children's fraction understanding in day-to-day life. And then the moderators from our longitudinal study we looked at were demographics, attention, working memory, verbal memory, nonverbal ability, and fluency. Okay, so, and the other thing I just wanted to mention is we did incorporate principles from the science and learning, which I'll show you, that are very important to help us think about how to make these findings stick. The intervention in our grant that we have, it's a really exciting grant because the first year we were able to develop and test the intervention with researcher instructors, and that's what I'm going to show you today. And then year 3, which we're doing right now as I speak, we're working collaboratively with teachers in the Delaware schools to train them to carry out the intervention. And then next year, we're going to do a pilot study that tests the effects of the intervention when they're carried out by the actual 6th grade teachers. And this is very important because if we develop an intervention and it works and whatever, but teachers don't like it or they don't find it easy or practical to use, it's not going to be any good. So we first wanted to say, okay, we have an intervention that works, and then we're going to continue to use it and to refine it so teachers can use it effectively. Our participants in this particular study were 6th graders in 2 public schools where we administered a validated fraction screener that's very predictive. We had 51 struggling students, and we randomly assigned them to our intervention or a business as usual control, which basically had computer-based instruction using iReady. 30% of the kids in our interventions, or in both of these groups, had diagnosed reading learning disabilities. So you can see kids with reading, many of them struggle in math as well. And we had a number of measures that I've already discussed that we've looked at. And our study design was we tested all of the children at pre-test before the intervention on the cognitive covariates as well as the math measures. Our intervention, we had 20, it was nice because we were able to have 25 sessions, and they were 40-minute scripted lessons. And then, as I mentioned, the control got the same amount of lessons with the iReady computer adaptive software. And then we tested the children right after the intervention, and then at 7 weeks delay to see if the findings held over time. And then I wanted to mention too, the children who participated in the control group, because it's sort of, we felt it was kind of unethical, to have them, okay, they sign up for the study, but they get stuck in the control group. So what we did is as a courtesy, we provided them the intervention afterwards, and we were able to use that information to continue to refine our interventions, so to get a little extra data there. So it worked out for everybody. Because, when you're just doing developmental studies, parents don't really care if their kids participate. But if they say, give permission to get an intervention and they don't get it, and then they just get tested, it can be, uncomfortable for us. Okay, so our instructional strategies, just a few things I wanted to point out. We used fractions with only a few denominators to teach many concepts, because these are the denominators children are very familiar with, so they can think about them in a meaningful way. We emphasize the meaning of the numerator, the denominator, and how they work. They must work together. They must work in concert. We emphasized equivalence. And a lot of children, it was amazing, they didn't know that when the numerator and the denominator are the same, because they're not looking at them as working together, they don't realize that no matter what the numbers are, if they're the same, the fraction is always 1. That 8/8 is 12/12, and 1 million, 1 millionths, is... it's always 1. So we kind of really emphasize that and help children to use that as a benchmark. And we also ask them to find the whole, to think of what. Even if you're on a number line, what's the whole? 2 miles, 1 mile, and so on. Because a lot of children they don't think about fractions as a relation to a whole or more than a whole. We use benchmarks of 0, 1, and 1/2 on the number line. And then to build multiplicative reasoning and fact fluency, we did use oral activities because we wanted to make sure, since we were using only a small number of denominators, we wanted to make sure that children were pretty fluent with the multiplication of facts that were relevant to those fractions. This is just kind of just to show you that all of our lessons were structured in the same way to provide kind of predictability and continuity, and actually the children really like it. We find it when we're done, and these are 6th graders who are in middle school, and they're like, oh, are we finished? They really are kind of enjoying engaging in the intervention. We have, and I also want to say we have all these activities kind of we're using them now with larger groups, but we've done them with groups with 7, up through groups of 14. So we have a predictable set of activities. We anchored our instruction in a meaningful context, which in this case was a color run, because races kind of fit nicely with a number line. And so we had kids think about the number line as being a course for a color run race. And so when they were shown a 0 to 2 line, students understood it was a 2-mile course for the color run. And then when kids get to particular places, the runners would be showered with colored powder at every half mile. And so the activities required students to be flexible because we used different size number lines. They weren't always the same. Maybe 0 to 2, 0 to 3, 0 to 1, 0 to 4, and so on. Because children with learning difficulties in particular, often you teach them one way and then they just learn that in a fairly rote way. So we wanted to get children to think about different contexts. And that's another thing too. We didn't just use the number line. just the way it's not good just to use kind of the pie models. We also use things like fraction bars, fraction strips that help children think about, that how this is the same as this. And so they took the fraction bars and they separated them into halves and fourths, and then we would engage these kinds of activities on a number line as well. We also had children label. We thought this was really important, labeling equivalent fractions. So here they are using the denominators of 2. Then we moved in and had them think about fourths. And so there they can see how 4 fourths aligns with 2 twos and so on the number line. And then we had them, fill in everything here so they really can see why, 2 fractions with different numbers are equivalent or they indicate the same value. And then with fraction bars, we did something similar where they could see 1/2 is the same as 2 fourths and 4/8, and so on. Now, we also blended in instruction with rulers because rulers are a natural number line. And interestingly enough, I don't know if you guys in your school have found that children have much experience with rulers, but we found that some children in our intervention had never done anything with a ruler. And they didn't even get the basics of what a ruler is. So we thought the ruler is a great real-world context to help them think about a different example of the number line so they could see, this makes 2 fourths and so on. And they really enjoyed measuring and doing those kinds of activities. But again, we had to go back to basics with them to help them understand. And then to be thinking about the simplest form of fractions as well. The other thing I wanted to mention that we haven't talked about too much today, which I think is really important. For our fractions intervention, we sort of used an engineering approach where we kind of decided, with fractions, all the things we learned, we would put those into the intervention. And then also, we tried to incorporate principles from the science of learning that have really gained a lot of traction in recent years. There's this wonderful book out that it's actually based on the research, but it's written for, everyday people, for anybody to read. It's called Making It Stick by Brown and Rodinger, and they talk about the kinds of approaches that help children, not just to learn, but help them to remember, to make the instruction stick. So we included some things that have been shown to be good. First of all, explicit instruction, which we've already talked about, but also using representational gestures, including verbal and visual dual coding. And I'll show you examples. Interleaved and spaced practice. Practice is a really important element of any intervention. And then providing feedback, which would be both immediate and scaffolded. So with respect to representational gestures, kids tend to use gestures. Sometimes you can see what their understanding is through gestures. And so here, when we would maybe use gestures to help children chunk 1/2 mile and, to focus their attention in a particular place on the number line. We incorporated always visual and verbal presentations. So they would use, we would say 1/4, we would have the symbol for 1/4, and then they would be able to visualize, too, what 1/4 represents. And then in terms of space and interleaved practice, I don't know if you guys have heard, I hadn't heard of the word of interleaved until we started, reading in cognitive science. But spaced means that, if you teach a fraction concept in day 1, you have them practice it not just in day 1, but you have them practice, at different points throughout the entire instructional period. Interleaved means that you take different types of problems and you interleave them in the practice session. So, for example, if you teach, fraction addition with common denominators, you might initially just chunk all the problems and have them practice with those. But then eventually you might want to weave in uncommon denominators into the practice, or subtraction into the practice, or multiplication, so they're seeing different types of problems during their practice activities, which really make them think and retrieve the information to perform the problems. Because so often children with learning disabilities, they kind of like, again, they have practice in one type of context, but you give them something else and they're totally thrown off. So, just finally, the results of our study. We were really, we did like at the, we looked to see if our groups were equivalent at pretest, and we found that they were, except for on receptive vocabulary. I think the control was a little bit better there, so we controlled for that in our studies because, as we talked about, vocabulary can have an important impact on response to intervention. Here we did, though, we found that the intervention children performed better than the control at immediate and delayed post-test on fraction concepts, fraction number line estimation, and fraction comparisons. Maybe we can talk about this, improvements in fraction arithmetic. They did get better for the experimental group, but those differences weren't reliable. So this is what it looks like for fraction number line estimation. You can see that these are the control kids. They're kind of, getting, they're making sort of increases, but I'm sorry, not fraction number line estimation, fraction concepts. During the intervention period, the intervention kids make a large spike, and then they pretty much sustain it over time. And those effect sizes were over a standard deviation unit from pre to post test. So they were strong, and they decreased a bit, but they basically held over time. Here's the fraction number line estimation. Again, the lower scores are the better. And the intervention kids, they got really accurate after our instruction, and they held. Whereas these kids, you can see kids aren't getting much experience with fraction magnitudes in school, so they aren't really making much progress in that area. And then this was just another example of fraction comparisons, where you can again see that the intervention children do much better, make a big gain, and they hold it over time. And another thing we were interested in was the moderators, the cognitive moderators of performance. We didn't have any hypotheses, so this was basically an exploratory analysis. And what we found was a significant interaction between attention, remember in that classroom behavior survey, and the intervention. And here you can kind of see these are kids that are low attention. These are kids that are high attention. These are kids that are in the control group. These are low attention kids in the control group. They, at the end of the intervention, didn't do so well in fraction concepts. But kids who were low attention in the intervention group, they made huge gains on fraction concepts, whereas the high attention kids regarding, there wasn't much difference between the control and the intervention. So basically here, we felt that the intervention had a buffering effect on the normally negative impact of low attention, a low attentive behavior on children's learning. So, to conclude, the intervention yielded large effects on conceptual understanding of fractions at immediate post-test, and we are very excited that the gains were sustained even at a 7-week delay. And we did feel like some of this was associated with those principles that have shown to improve learning or to make it stick. Even students at risk for math failure made robust gains when we had carefully designed intervention. We felt like future work should continue to address, though, how to improve fraction arithmetic. We didn't really have a focus on this phase of the intervention, but we are working on that now. Also, to what extent can we actually close the gap? I mean, the intervention kids are getting better than the controls, but how can we close the gap between kids with math difficulties and normal achievers? And then again, how do these improvements in fraction understanding translate into later algebra outcomes? And our current goal, as I mentioned, is to develop the intervention so it's feasible for use in whole class settings. And then I just wanted to show you this. This is an example of common fact practice that we think, just based on our findings, we're speculating that you should probably avoid for students who have reading disabilities in 3rd grade, because it really does stress their, the written representations. And then finally, I just wanted to give a shout out to our amazing research team, which I couldn't have done without their assistance. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few questions. First, do you have any recommendations of math screeners?
Yes.
Including your own.
That's a really good question, because one of my graduate student, Jessica Rodriguez, who just took an assistant professor position at the University of Missouri, for her dissertation, she validated our fraction screener using receiver operating ROC curve analyses that shows that this screener is highly predictive and it's very practical. We did use the release NAEP items. So that screener, it's not published yet, but it is available if you wanted to contact me. It's a quick screener that has shown to be highly effective. So yes, but there aren't as many screeners for the intermediate grade children as there are for the younger children. And we also have a grant, though, where we are expanding our number sense screener, which is published by Brooks, by the way. And that is going to, now it's right just for kindergartners, but we're expanding down to pre-K and up through 1st grade. So we're just getting the data on that for young children with early number sense.
Now here's a question, I'm not sure if it refers to fractions alone, but somebody might clarify. What are the different profiles of students with math difficulties, that is, between those with math-only learning difficulties and those with math and reading difficulties?
Yes, there are different profiles. That was my original research program, actually, what I got funded from NIH or NICHD on, that we do find that first of all, the children with the more severe the math difficulty, the more likely you are to have a concurrent reading difficulty, because if you have good language skills, you're usually able to pick up your math to a certain extent, so you might still have a math disability, but you're probably going to be stronger, you're not going to be at the bottom end of the continuum. So often, often those kids, the math RD kids are very low, but also we find that sometimes the kids with isolated math difficulties, it's very much related to the fluency and the timing, that they can do well, except they're not very good in doing it really quickly. Whereas kids with both math and reading difficulties, sometimes they have more, as Lynn mentioned, they have more of the basic level understanding, so they'll have a hard time with word problems. Like if you have an isolated math difficulty, word problems might be a real strength for you because you have good language ability. But then when you have to do it quickly and engage in the mathematical calculation, that can be problematic.
I might just jump in to say that there's a study published last year that suggests that using fMRI that students compared the various kinds of brain activity for students with math disability only, reading disability only, or co-occurring math and reading disabilities, that suggested, and this is one finding, that those with co-occurring math and reading disabilities had a distinct neural signature, different to some extent from those with either reading or math.
Oh, that's
whatever
interesting.
the implications are. Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, but we found that kids with math, our original development sort of suggested that the math difficulties were similar in the MD only and the MDRD, but the MDRD had the reading that went along with it, and the MD kids could compensate with the language. So, but that's very interesting to see. There might be that take something else different going on.
Okay, another one. These results are quite powerful. How can the techniques be used that you use be made available to school districts in the Philadelphia area that have low SES?
Oh, that's a great question. And because our materials are designed, our kids are really, really low functioning. We were using, schools that serve low-income communities, kids who are, and we didn't take out certain kids with behavioral issues or anything. We included everybody who gave permission and performed below a particular level on our fraction screener. And so we have developed materials now that, and actually because we found in our school district, our 2 school districts actually, that it wasn't practical to provide, they had these intervention periods in middle school, and it wasn't practical to provide this very small group instruction of, maybe 7 children. And then in their response to intervention periods, there were groups of 14 or 15 kids. So we were thinking, okay, if that's what it is, we're going to have to provide some kind of intervention that would accommodate that. So we actually, and Nancy Dyson, who's been working a lot on this, we put them on PowerPoint slides. So when we have animations and all these things, and we actually found that we did just as well with groups of 14 as groups of 7, because sometimes the smaller groups, the kids kind of they get into each other's business more than with the kind of the larger group. With the PowerPoint, we could engage kids more. And those materials will be available, and we would love to work with you, any school district. Especially Philadelphia would be awesome for the lower functioning kids to incorporate these kinds of materials, because that's what we're working now, and we really would like to scale up to show the overall effectiveness. So yeah, and we have designed them so they're really quite easy to use. We're getting feedback from teachers as we work on them. Then they tell us what things are unclear, what things work and don't work. So.
Just a few more. What was the name of the fraction screener you used?
It is called, they're from released items from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. But it was informal because there was nothing available, but if you write me, we can send you the screener and the validation data, and hopefully those data will be formally published soon.
Okay. Do you recommend any commercial math tests that are available to teachers that would assess whole number estimation and non-symbolic proportional reasoning?
Well, the non-symbolic proportional reasoning, those pretty much are experimental measures at this point. And the whole number estimation, you will find it on tests like the Key Math diagnostic test, or the Wyatt or the Woodcock-Johnson. I don't think those tests are horrible, but they don't necessarily give you as much information because they're general, they're pretty general measures. And the test of the TEMA for the young kids. But yeah, I don't know, but with the number line estimation, if you were interested, I don't know if there is any measure. Those are pretty much experimental measures, but we are if you're interested in the younger kids, for first grade, our measure hopefully will be out soon that does have that on there. It's called the SENSE, the Screener for Early Number Sense, that will hopefully be out in the next year or so. Along with and we do have our number sense interventions too, that's based on what you find in the screener. So, but fractions, yeah, for these middle school screeners, there isn't all that much out there. Right. There are all these kind of 1-minute time measures, which I find very unsatisfying because you can't really see what the child's thinking is. So.
Last one, sort of a broader
Last
one.
But not
I don't
least.
think it's a trick question. I'm not.
I like trick questions.
When do you think it is okay for struggling students to use a calculator?
That's a very good question. I think, I mean, of course, everybody learns to use a calculator, right? We all use them. But I don't think you want to give up on the students, because if you use a calculator and you have no understanding, you can make all kinds of mistakes. And you don't always have a calculator when you're doing something, when you're thinking about numbers. So I would use it sparingly in the elementary grades, and it would depend on the purpose of the instruction. And like if you're in the middle grades, yes, sometimes they might use the calculator, but other times, no. I would, like really, in some ways, I don't know what you think, Dan, maybe avoid even through middle school, because I just remember my son in his 8th grade math, she wouldn't let them use calculators at all, and I thought that was a really good thing, because they had to like calculate with fractions really fast and stuff. But there are some kids that they absolutely have such a hard time that they do need the compensatory strategies, but you don't want to give up on developing some basic fluency, and because calculators will only get you so far. What do you think, Dan?
Oh, time's up. No,
I think he's a math person too.
There may be some ways to integrate the use of calculators depending upon what the students struggle with the other instructions. So it's not necessarily just doing things that are automated without learning what you're doing while you're carrying out some of those calculations. And I can tell you very quickly of a parent who once told me that a daughter who was in the 5th grade did excellent work in all her other academic subjects, and an excellent reader, but her math work was at the level of the 1st grade. She was much more severe in her difficulties, math difficulties, and they had her use a calculator, but she had trouble remembering where the numbers were located on the calculator.
Right.
So again, you have to look at other characteristics, and it's not necessarily making it easier for everyone.
Right, and there's just like so many ways where you get these weird mistakes, and if you can't evaluate them, if you don't have a sense of numerical magnitude, you'll, and I just think it's, if children can understand, it's so much more satisfying than to kind of go through the math curriculum with just, and children, that's a marker of how smart children feel they are. They found that, if children are good at math, they always think that means you're smart. And if you're not good at math, you're inadequate in some ways. And I think we give up on math learning in too many kids, and I think they can learn so much more and make some sense out of it through good targeted instruction. So, and we hope we don't have as many kids that reach 6th grade and that are so impoverished in their fraction understanding. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Eric, thank you. Closing remarks? Pat?
This was an amazing event, so please join me in thanking all of the speakers today again for this amazing, amazing event. And Dan, you did a great job as our facilitator. We appreciate that greatly. We had great time listening to Guinevere, to Doug, and Lynn Fuchs, and most recently, Nancy Jordan. That broad spectrum of information was just amazing. We appreciate that. And Nancy, thank you for all your support. And Ron, that conversation, I think, really hit home for a lot of us in terms of what are those obstacles, how might we think about engaging the whole community. And Ron, it was very fitting to highlight the work of Read by Fourth. Amazing work there, so kudos to everyone and all the partners involved in that organization as well. We do again thank our sponsors who were able to make this happen for us, Understood Streaming this, as well as Wilson Language and NCLD and Brooks Publishing. A couple of thank yous, a big shout out to Deborah Lynham and Sarucci, who were manning our online community, lots of activity. We don't get to see it here in the room, but a lot of interest and activity online. Thank you. And Carol Purcell and all of the other folks here at the AIM Institute who make this happen. I would be remiss, though, I have to admit, the most heartwarming piece was watching Ken and Hollis go back and forth a bit. Ken, that was an amazing introduction of Hollis, and Hollis, as usual, your intellect and your caring for the community totally came through in your presentation, as well as your humor, which we have learned over the years, and it was very, very humbling to see all the recognition you gave everyone. It really speaks to the community. Please make sure you take your card for next year's symposium. Very, very important topic for all of us to think about. The role of resiliency in the classroom as we look at these areas of literacy and numeracy. Why not all children respond to reading instruction and what teachers need to know? We're fortunate to have with us today Dr. Tim Odegaard, who will be helping to facilitate the symposium next year. And again, we have Fumiko Haft, Maureen Lovett, Stephanie Alatabo. I want to make sure I say it correctly. And we're really, really excited to have that infused in all of our thinking, as I know this year's symposium really made us all think about the intersection of reading and math. So thank you all for being here. Please continue the conversations, and hopefully we'll be able to see more and more communication online as we provide more and more of these activities and research for all of you. So thank you very much. Oh, and I have a public service announcement. We take green schools very seriously here. So if you have a water bottle or any kind of plastic, or the plastic wrapper container in which your lunch came, would you please take the time to recycle those plastics or cans? So we would appreciate that very much. Again, safe travels, and for those of you online, we hope to see you back next year as well. Take care.